The first signs of a money war never arrive with sirens or declarations, because financial conflict does not announce itself as conflict at all. It disguises itself as policy, as stabilization, as reform, as necessity. And by the time ordinary citizens sense that something irreversible has begun, the architecture of the old system is already being dismantled from the inside. Long before the word crisis reaches the headlines, capital has already moved, reserves have already shifted, debts have already been restructured, and the world has quietly crossed a line that cannot be Every great monetary conflict in history has followed this pattern, from the collapse of Roman silver coinage to the gold drain of interwar Europe, to the slow unraveling of Bretton Woods. And now, once again, we are living through the early invisible phase of another global realignment, in which currencies are no longer neutral tools of exchange, but strategic instruments of power, leverage, and survival. What is happening now is not a recession, not a correction, not even a financial crisis in the traditional sense, but the reactivation of an older logic that governed empires long before stock markets existed. The logic that whoever controls money controls the future, and whoever loses control of money loses everything else soon after. This is a story of how that logic has returned, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow-motion conflict unfolding through interest rates, reserve currencies, sanctions, debt contracts, and central bank balance sheets, reshaping global power without a single shot being fired, and quietly deciding which nations will rise, which will decline, and which will find themselves trapped inside systems they no longer control. 2. Context and stakes. The world today appears outwardly stable, with functioning banks, operating stock exchanges, flowing trade, and digital payments moving faster than ever. Yet, beneath that surface, the foundations of the post-Cold War financial order are shifting in ways that closely resemble the pre-collapse conditions of earlier eras. Public and private debt have reached levels unseen outside of wartime monetary. Authorities are trapped between inflation and instability. Geopolitical rivalries have migrated from battlefields into balance sheets, and currencies themselves have become instruments of strategic competition rather than neutral mediums of exchange. This matters because modern societies are built not merely on political systems or legal institutions, but on monetary, trustless shared belief that money will hold value, that contracts will be honored, that savings represent future security, and that the rules governing economic life will remain predictable enough for people to plan their lives around them. When that trust erodes, even gradually, the result is not only inflation or volatility, but social fragmentation, political extremism, and the weakening of democratic institutions, as history has repeatedly shown. The money war is not fought between soldiers, but between incentives, between reserve managers and finance ministries, between central banks adjusting interest rates and governments issuing debt, between global trade flows and capital controls. And it is precisely because this conflict is abstract and technical that it is so powerful. Because it reshapes the world without ever appearing on a battlefield or in a history book until long after its consequences have become unavoidable. 3. Historical rewind sequence. To understand how money becomes a weapon, it is necessary to return to the moments when monetary systems collapsed, not because of accidents, but because of structural contradictions that had become impossible to sustain. In the late Roman Empire, the steady debasement of silver coinage funded imperial expenses in the short term, while hollowing out the economy in the long term. As inflation rose, trade collapsed, and confidence in the currency disintegrated, leaving Rome unable to maintain its military or administrative systems. In the Weimar Republic, the hyperinflation of the early 1920s did not arise from reckless printing alone, but from the attempt to service unpayable war debts and reparations through monetary expansion, a policy choice that destroyed savings, shattered social trust, and radicalized politics in ways that would later prove catastrophic. During the Great Depression, the gold standard transformed financial stress into a global deflationary spiral, as countries that attempted to defend their gold reserves were forced to raise interest rates and cut spending during economic collapse, deepening unemployment and social unrest, while those that abandoned gold earlier recovered faster, revealing that monetary rigidity could be as destructive as monetary excess. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system attempted to prevent a return to these dynamics by anchoring currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, creating a stable framework for trade and reconstruction. Yet, even this system carried within it the seeds of its own breakdown, because the global demand for dollars eventually exceeded the United States' ability to maintain gold convertibility, leading to the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971 and the birth of the fiat currency era. Each of these moments reveals the same underlying truth that monetary systems do not collapse randomly, but when their internal contradictions grow larger than their ability to absorb them, and when political needs overwhelm economic constraints. 4. Narrative deep dive. What followed the collapse of Bretton Woods was not chaos, but a new form of order, one built on floating exchange rates, expanding global capital markets, and the dollar's role as the dominant reserve currency, supported not by gold, but by trust, liquidity, and the depths of US financial markets. For decades, this system delivered stability, growth, and integration, allowing emerging economies to industrialize, multinational trade to expand, and global finance to knit the world together into a single, interconnected network. Yet the system also created new asymmetries, because countries that controlled reserve currencies gained extraordinary privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply, to run persistent deficits, and to influence global financial conditions, while countries without reserve status became dependent on foreign capital, vulnerable to capital flight, and constrained by the need to maintain investor confidence. Over time, these asymmetries hardened into structural imbalances as the United States accumulated debt, export-oriented economies accumulated dollar reserves, and global trade became increasingly dependent on a single monetary center. What began as stability gradually evolved into dependency, and what appeared as integration quietly transformed into vulnerability. 5. Mechanism breakdown. At the heart of the money war lies the interaction between debt, currency, and power. Governments finance themselves through debt issuance, which must be purchased by investors or central banks, creating a system in which financial stability depends on confidence in both political institutions and monetary authorities. Central banks influence this system through interest rates, which affects borrowing costs, asset prices, and capital flows, and through balance sheet operations that expand or contract liquidity. When interest rates are low, debt becomes easier to service, asset prices rise, and borrowing increases. But this also encourages leverage and speculation, storing risk within the system. When inflation rises, central banks are forced to tighten, raising rates and draining liquidity, which stabilizes prices, but destabilizes debtors, including governments themselves, creating fiscal stress, political pressure, and financial fragility. In a globally integrated system, these decisions do not remain domestic because capital moves across borders in response to yield, risk, and currency expectations, meaning that one central bank's policy can destabilize entire regions, triggering crises that appear local but are systemic in origin. 6. Parallel to today's world exhibits all the hallmarks of this dynamic, with global debt at record highs, inflation returning after decades of dormancy, central banks reversing years of easy money, and geopolitical tensions transforming financial tools into strategic weapons through sanctions, trade restrictions, and currency controls. The freezing of reserves, the weaponization of payment systems, and the fragmentation of global trade networks are not anomalies, but signals that money itself has become a domain of conflict, where access, trust, and liquidity are contested rather than assumed. 7. Hidden forces and power structures. Behind these shifts stand institutions whose actions shape outcomes without ever appearing on ballots or battlefields, including central banks, reserve managers, sovereign wealth funds, multinational corporations, and financial regulators, whose incentives are shaped by stability mandates, political constraints, and systemic risk rather than democratic deliberation. These institutions do not conspire, but they do respond predictably to incentives. And it is this predictability that generates unintended collective outcomes that no single actor intends, but everyone participates in. 8. Acceleration phase, as debt accumulates, as demographics strain pension systems, as climate risks raise capital costs, and as geopolitical rivalries fragment trade the system's capacity to absorb shocks declines, making each crisis more than the last, and each intervention more consequential. History shows that once this acceleration begins, it rarely reverses voluntarily, because the political costs of restraint are immediate, while the economic costs of excess are delayed, creating a bias toward decisions that stabilize the present at the expense of the future. 9. Climax and revelation. The revelation is not that collapse is inevitable, but that monetary systems fail when they are asked to solve political problems they were never designed to handle. And the money war returns whenever societies attempt to defer real choices about consumption, power, and responsibility by shifting them into financial abstractions. Money becomes a battlefield when trust becomes scarce, and trust becomes scarce when institutions no longer align incentives with long-term stability. 10. Ending. The money war has returned, not because leaders chose conflict, but because the structures that once made cooperation profitable have weakened, leaving competition as the default mode of survival. Whether this ERA ends in fragmentation or renewal depends not on markets alone, but on whether societies can rebuild institutions capable of sustaining trust, absorbing risk, and aligning power with responsibility before instability becomes irreversible. Because, in the end, every money war is also a war over the future. And the outcome is decided long before anyone realizes that the conflict has even begun.